James Robinson stood before the Ames City Council on a Tuesday evening in late February, the kind of cold that made Iowa feel like it was testing you. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with that particular frequency that turned every face in the room into something hard to read. Richard Connor sat 3 rows back with 2 lawyers who looked like they'd never missed a mortgage payment in their lives. Elizabeth Morrison sat beside James, her hands folded on the table in front of her, still as stone. The council president, a man named Gerald Hutchins, who'd run a hardware store for 40 years before retiring, adjusted his reading glasses and looked down at the complaint James had filed 6 weeks earlier. "Mr. Robinson, you're here because you claim Morrison Construction terminated your employment in violation of Iowa labor statutes. Is that correct?" James kept his voice level. "I'm here because I was fired for refusing to terminate a good employee 10 days before Christmas. They said I couldn't work as part of a team. I said I wouldn't fire good people just to improve a profit margin." Someone in the back coughed. A reporter from the Ames Tribune scribbled something on a notepad. Gerald Hutchins nodded slowly, like he'd heard worse, but not by much. "We'll hear testimony from both parties. Mr. Connor, you'll have your chance to respond." Richard leaned back in his chair, supremely confident. James recognized that posture. He'd seen it 100 times on job sites when someone with a title thought the rules bent around them instead of through them. The story had started 10 weeks earlier, on a December morning that felt like any other. James woke at 6, same as always. The alarm on his phone played something quiet, a piano piece Sarah had picked years ago because she said mornings should start gentle. He let it play for 30 seconds before turning it off, staring at the ceiling in the blue dark of an Iowa winter, and then swinging his legs out of bed. Michael's medication sat on the kitchen counter in a white organizer marked with the days of the week. Tuesday, 2 pills, both small and pink. James filled a glass with water, set it beside the organizer, and started on breakfast. Oatmeal with brown sugar and sliced banana. Michael wouldn't eat it if the banana was too ripe, or if the oatmeal was too hot, or if James forgot to put the sugar in before the banana. There was a system. 3 years of single fatherhood had taught James that systems mattered more than inspiration. The house was small, a rental on the south edge of Ames that backed up to a drainage field and a line of trees that stayed bare from November through March. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen that opened into a living room with carpet that had been beige once and was now something closer to gray. Sarah's picture sat on the mantel above a fireplace that didn't work, her smile frozen in a moment from 5 years ago when Michael was 2 and she was still well enough to believe the treatments might give her another decade. James kissed the photo frame, same as every morning, and went to wake his son. Michael slept with a stuffed bear named Cooper tucked under one arm, his face pressed into the pillow at an angle that looked uncomfortable but apparently wasn't. James sat on the edge of the bed and put a hand on Michael's shoulder. "Time to get up, bud." Michael groaned and rolled over, eyes still closed. 5 more minutes. "You said that yesterday." "Yesterday's 5 minutes are today's 0 minutes." Michael opened one eye, saw his father's face, and closed it again. "That's not fair." "Life's not fair. Oatmeal's getting cold." That got him moving. Michael sat up, rubbed his eyes, and reached for Cooper with the automatic reflex of a child who'd decided long ago that some things were non-negotiable. The bear went everywhere. School, doctor's appointments, the grocery store, church on the Sundays when James felt like going. Sarah had given it to Michael the week before she died, which meant it was more than a toy. It was a promise she'd tried to keep. They ate breakfast in the kind of silence that didn't need filling. Michael scooped oatmeal into his mouth with the focus of a kid who understood hunger wasn't theoretical. James drank coffee and watched his son and thought about the meeting scheduled for 9 that morning, the one Richard Connor had sent an email about late the night before with the subject line "Budget Review." After breakfast, James checked Michael's backpack. Homework folder, check. Lunchbox, check. Permission slip for the field trip next week, check. He zipped it closed and handed it to Michael, who slung it over one shoulder with the bear tucked under the other arm. They drove to school in James's truck, a 15-year-old Ford with rust along the wheel wells and a passenger seat that didn't adjust anymore. The radio played classic rock at low volume. Michael hummed along to a song he didn't know the words to, his breath fogging the window as he drew a bridge with one finger in the condensation. "What's that?" Michael didn't look away from the window. "Your bridge. The one you're building." James was a structural engineer at Morrison Construction, and for the past 8 months he'd been working on a pedestrian bridge that would span a ravine on the east side of town. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was precise work, the kind where you measured twice and welded once because mistakes cost lives. Michael had watched the blueprint spread across the dining room table enough times to recognize the shape. "It's not done yet." "When will it be done?" "Spring, if we stay on schedule." Michael wiped the window with his sleeve, erasing the drawing. "Will it fall down?" "No." "How do you know?" "Because I'm building it right." They pulled up to Sawyer Elementary, a low brick building with a playground that looked like it had been designed in the 70s and maintained with hope. Michael unbuckled his seatbelt, grabbed his backpack and Cooper, and opened the door. Cold air rushed in, sharp enough to make James's eyes water. "Love you, bud." Michael paused, one foot on the ground, and looked back. "Love you too, Dad." Then he was gone, running toward the entrance where other kids clustered in groups of 2 and 3, their voices carrying across the parking lot in bursts of laughter and argument. James watched until Michael disappeared inside, then pulled out of the lot and headed toward Morrison Construction. The office sat on the north side of Ames, a squat concrete building with a sign out front that read, "Morrison Construction, Building, Iowa, since 1962. James parked in his usual spot, 3rd row back, and walked in through the side entrance that led directly to the engineering wing. The hallways smelled like coffee and printer ink and the faint metallic tang of drafting equipment that had been used hard and maintained harder. His desk was clean. That was deliberate. James didn't believe in clutter. Blueprints got rolled and stored. Tools went back in drawers. The only personal item was a framed photo of Michael holding Cooper at the zoo, his gap-toothed smile wide enough to make you forget about the scar on his chest from the second surgery. Richard Connor's office was 2 doors down, a corner space with windows that looked out over the parking lot. The door was open. Richard sat behind his desk, a man in his mid-40s with the kind of tan that came from ski trips and resort vacations, his hair styled in a way that suggested he paid someone to make it look casual. "Blake, come in." James stepped inside. The office was larger than it needed to be, decorated with plaques and photos from projects Morrison had completed over the years. Richard gestured to a chair. "Close the door." James closed it and sat. Richard folded his hands on the desk, the picture of a man about to deliver news he'd already decided was reasonable. "We need to talk about restructuring." James waited. He'd learned a long time ago that the person who spoke first in these conversations usually lost. Richard opened a folder, scanned a page, and looked up. "Revenue's down 8% year over year. The board's concerned. We're being asked to cut costs across all departments." "What kind of cuts?" "Personnel. 5 positions across engineering and operations." James felt something tighten in his chest, but his face stayed neutral. "Who?" Richard slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. 5 names printed in neat rows. Angela Martinez was 3rd from the top. "These are the recommendations from HR performance reviews, tenure, cost-benefit analysis, standard metrics." James looked at the list. Angela Martinez was 29, a single mother with 2 kids under 10. She worked in project coordination, the kind of job where you answered phones and filed permits and made sure contractors didn't schedule concrete pours on the same day as electrical inspections. She was good at it. Punctual, thorough, never complained. Angela's been here 3 years. Her reviews are solid. "This isn't about performance, it's about budget." James set the paper down. "Christmas is 10 days away." Richard's expression didn't change. "That's why we're doing it now. Get it done before the holiday so people can make plans." "Make plans for what? Unemployment doesn't pay rent." "Blake, I get it. This isn't easy, but we're a business, not a charity." Richard leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking softly. "You're being considered for VP of Engineering. Jenkins is retiring in March. The board wants someone who can make the tough calls." James looked at the list again. Angela's name sat there like an accusation. "You want me to fire these people?" "I want you to understand what leadership looks like. Sometimes you have to make decisions that hurt in the short term to protect the company long term." "And if I don't?" Richard's smile was thin, professional. "Then we'll find someone who will." James stood. He didn't pick up the list. "I need to think about it. You've got until Friday, 9 a.m. James walked out of the office, down the hallway, past the break room where someone had left a half-eaten donut on a paper plate. His hands were shaking. He shoved them in his pockets and kept walking until he reached his desk, where he sat down and stared at the framed photo of Michael. 3 years ago, when Sarah died, James had made a promise to himself and to the memory of his wife. He would raise their son to be a good man, not a rich man, not a successful man by the standards of people like Richard Connor, but a good man, the kind who kept his word, the kind who didn't hurt people just because it was convenient. He thought about Angela. 2 kids. Christmas, 10 days away. A termination notice that would land like a bomb in her life. He thought about Michael, drawing bridges on foggy windows, asking if they'd fall down. He thought about Sarah, 3 days before she died, her hand in his, her voice so quiet he had to lean in to hear her. "Don't let them make you someone you're not. Michael's watching. He'll learn who you are from what you do, not what you say." James opened his desk drawer and pulled out his phone. He scrolled through his contacts until he found Stephen Harris, his best friend since high school, a plumber who'd built his own business from a single truck and a willingness to show up when other people wouldn't. The phone rang twice before Stephen answered. "What's up?" James kept his voice low. "I need to talk. You free for lunch?" "Always? Usual place?" "Yeah. See you at noon." James hung up and stared at his computer screen, where an email from Richard sat in his inbox with the subject line, "Restructuring Timeline, Confidential." He didn't open it. He already knew what it would say. The diner was called Sam's, a place on Highway 30 with vinyl booths and a menu that hadn't changed since 1987. Stephen was already there when James arrived, sitting in the back corner with a cup of coffee and a newspaper spread out in front of him. He looked up when James slid into the booth across from him. "You look like hell." "Thanks." Stephen folded the newspaper and set it aside. "What's going on?" James told him. The list. Angela's name. Richard's ultimatum. The VP position hanging out there like bait on a hook. Stephen listened without interrupting, his face going from neutral to something harder as the story unfolded. When James finished, Stephen leaned back and shook his head. "They're asking you to fire a single mom 10 days before Christmas." "Yeah. And if you don't, they'll fire you." "Probably." Stephen picked up his coffee, took a long drink and set it down harder than necessary. "What are you going to do?" James looked out the window at the parking lot, where a semi was pulling in and a woman was getting out of a sedan with 2 kids who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. "I don't know." "Yeah, you do." James turned back to Stephen. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means you're not the kind of guy who fires people to save his own ass. You never have been." "I've got Michael to think about." "Michael's exactly why you won't do it." Stephen leaned forward, his voice dropping. "You've been raising that kid on your own for 3 years. You think he doesn't see who you are? You think he won't notice if you come home and tell him you did something that made you feel like shit just to keep a paycheck?" James didn't answer. He didn't need to. The waitress came by and took their order. 2 burgers, fries, a refill on Stephen's coffee. When she left, Stephen pulled a napkin from the dispenser and started folding it into smaller and smaller squares, the way he always did when he was thinking through something complicated. "You need to tell Richard no." "And then what? I'm out of a job a week before Christmas." "How's that help, Michael?" "You'll find another job. You're good at what you do. People know that." Good doesn't pay the bills while I'm looking." Stephen stopped folding the napkin and looked at James with the kind of directness that came from 20 years of friendship. "You want me to loan you money? I can do that. We'll figure it out. But don't compromise on this. Angela Martinez doesn't deserve to get fired, and you don't deserve to be the guy who does it." James felt something loosen in his chest, just a little. "I'll pay you back." "I know you will." They ate in silence after that, the kind of comfortable quiet that didn't need words. When the check came, Stephen grabbed it before James could reach for it. "On me." "You don't have to do that." "I know. I'm doing it anyway." They walked out to the parking lot together. The sky was gray, heavy with the kind of clouds that promised snow but hadn't delivered yet. Stephen clapped James on the shoulder before heading to his truck. "Call me Friday. Let me know how it goes." "I will." James drove back to Morrison Construction, parked in his usual spot, and walked inside. The hallway was empty, the offices quiet except for the hum of computers and the distant sound of someone on a phone call. He sat at his desk and pulled up a blank document on his computer. He typed 3 sentences. "I cannot in good conscience terminate Angela Martinez. She is a valued employee with a solid record. If this decision disqualifies me from consideration for the VP position, I understand." He read it over twice, looking for something to soften the blow or hedge the language, and found nothing. He hit send. The response came 17 minutes later. "My office. Now." James walked down the hallway, knocked on Richard's door, and stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. Richard was standing by the window, arms crossed, his face unreadable. "You're serious about this?" "I am." Richard turned away from the window. "Blake, I'm trying to help you here. This is a career-making opportunity. VP of Engineering. You'd be set. Not if it costs me who I am. Who you are doesn't pay Michael's medical bills." James felt heat rise in his face, but he kept his voice level. "Don't talk about my son. I'm not trying to insult you. I'm trying to make you see reality. You think Angela Martinez is going to remember this in 5 years? You think she's going to send you a thank you card? She'll get another job. You won't. Maybe. But I'll be able to look at myself in the mirror." Richard exhaled slowly, the sound of a man running out of patience. "You're making a mistake. It's mine to make. Then you're done here. Effective immediately." The words landed like a punch, clean and final. James nodded once, turned, and walked out of the office. His hands weren't shaking anymore. They were steady. He packed his desk in under 10 minutes, blueprints rolled and secured with rubber bands. The photo of Michael slid into his jacket pocket. A coffee mug Sarah had given him years ago, the one with a quote from some poet she liked, wrapped in a spare T-shirt from the gym bag in his truck. Angela Martinez appeared in the doorway as he was finishing. Her eyes were red. "You didn't have to do that." James closed the box and picked it up. "Yes, I did. I don't understand. My son is 7 years old. He watches everything I do. I need him to see a father who does what's right, not what's easy." Angela started crying, quiet and composed, the way people cry when they've learned not to make a scene. "Thank you." James didn't trust himself to speak. He nodded and walked past her, down the hallway, through the lobby, and out into the parking lot where the sky had finally started to spit snow. Michael was sitting on the couch when James got home at 2 in the afternoon, a full 3 hours earlier than usual. Cooper sat beside him, propped up against the armrest. Michael looked up from the book he was reading, his face curious but not alarmed. "Why are you home?" James set the box down by the door and hung his jacket on the hook. "I made a choice today." "What kind of choice?" "The kind where you do what's right even if it costs you something." Michael closed the book. "Did you help someone?" "I tried to." "Then it was the right choice." James sat down beside his son and put an arm around his shoulders, pulling him close. Michael leaned into him, small and warm and certain in a way that made James's throat tighten. "You sure about that?" "Yeah. You always say doing the right thing matters more than anything else." I did say that. So you did the right thing. James kissed the top of Michael's head and held him there for a long time, listening to the sound of the furnace kicking on and the snow tapping against the windows. He didn't tell Michael about the job or the bills or the fact that his savings would last maybe 6 weeks if he was careful. There'd be time for that later. For now, he just held his son and let the weight of the day settle into something he could carry. Christmas came and went. James bought presents on credit, small things that wouldn't bury him but wouldn't feel like nothing either. A set of colored pencils for Michael, who liked to draw. A new blanket, because the old one had a hole. A book about bridges, because Michael kept asking questions James didn't always know how to answer. They ate dinner at Stephen's house on Christmas Eve, a loud, chaotic meal with Stephen's wife Linda and their 3 kids, all of them talking over each other in the way families do when they're comfortable. Michael sat between Stephen's youngest daughter and the turkey, his face bright with the kind of happiness that came from being included in something bigger than himself. Stephen pulled James aside while the kids were in the living room arguing over a board game. "How are you holding up?" "I'm fine." "You're not fine. You haven't found anything yet, have you?" James shook his head. He'd sent out a dozen applications in the past week. 2 had responded with polite rejections. The rest had gone silent. "It's Christmas week. Nobody's hiring." "I know." Stephen handed him an envelope. "Don't open it now. Just take it." James held the envelope, felt the weight of it. Cash, probably. Enough to cover a month's rent or Michael's medication or both. "I can't." "You can and you will. Consider it a loan. Pay me back when you're working again." James slid the envelope into his pocket. "Thank you. That's what friends do." They went back to the living room, where Linda was herding the kids toward the couch for a Christmas movie. Michael waved James over, patting the spot beside him like it had been reserved. James sat down and let his son lean against him. Cooper wedged between them and tried not to think about the stack of bills on the kitchen counter back home. January came in cold. The kind of cold that made Iowa feel personal, like it had a grudge. James woke on the 14th to a weather alert on his phone, the words scrolling across the screen in block letters. Blizzard warning. Travel not advised. Power outages likely. He checked the forecast. High of -6, low of -20. Snow accumulation between 16 and 20 inches. Wind gusts up to 40 miles per hour. He got up and started preparing. Flashlights charged and tested, batteries stockpiled, candles pulled from the back of the closet where they'd been sitting since the last storm 2 years ago. He filled the bathtub with water in case the pipes froze. He made sandwiches and wrapped them in foil and put them in the fridge where they'd stay cold even if the power went out. Michael watched from the doorway, Cooper tucked under one arm. "Is it going to be bad?" "Probably." "Are we going to be okay?" James looked at his son, 7 years old and already learning to measure risk in a way that wasn't fair for a kid his age. "Yes." "Promise?" "Promise." The storm hit at 4 in the afternoon. The wind picked up first, rattling the windows and bending the trees in the backyard until they looked like they might snap. Then the snow started, thick and fast, the kind that erased the world in minutes. By 6, the drifts against the front door were knee-high. By 7, James couldn't see the neighbor's house across the street. At 7:14, the power went out. Everything died at once. The hum of the refrigerator, the glow of the stove clock, the lamp in the living room where Michael had been reading. The house went dark and silent, and for a moment James just stood there in the kitchen, listening to the wind howl outside like something alive and angry. "Dad?" Michael's voice came from the living room, small and immediate. "I'm here. Stay where you are." James grabbed the flashlight off the counter and flicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, landing on Michael sitting cross-legged on the floor, Cooper in his lap, his eyes wide. "It's just the power. No big deal." "Is it going to come back on?" "Eventually." James walked to the thermostat in the hallway and checked it. 68 degrees. But the furnace wasn't running anymore, and without power, it wouldn't run at all. He had the propane backup heater in the garage, the one the landlord had mentioned when James signed the lease 2 years ago. He pulled on his coat and boots and pushed out the back door into a wind that felt like it had teeth. The propane tank sat against the fence, snow already piling against its base. James brushed the ice off the gauge with his glove and shone the flashlight on it. 8%. He stood there in the blizzard, the wind ripping at his jacket, and stared at that number. 8%. Maybe 3 hours of heat if he was lucky. After that, the temperature inside would start to drop, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He went back inside, stamped the snow off his boots, and pulled out his phone. No signal. He tried the landline. Dead. He tried his laptop, hoping for Wi-Fi. Nothing. The roads were closed. The power company wasn't answering. The propane supplier had an automated message saying they weren't making deliveries during the storm. They were on their own. James walked back to the living room, where Michael was still sitting on the floor, Cooper beside him now, both of them looking up at James like he had answers. "We're going to be fine. The heat will last a few more hours. By morning the storm will be over and we can figure it out." Michael nodded, trusting in the way kids trust when they don't have a choice. James didn't tell him about the 8%. He didn't tell him that the temperature outside was -15 and dropping. He didn't tell him that if the propane ran out before the power came back on, they'd be in serious trouble. He just sat down beside his son and pulled him close, and they waited. At 8:47, someone knocked on the front door. James stood slowly, confused. Nobody drove in weather like this. Nobody walked in weather like this. He grabbed the flashlight and went to the door, Cooper's silhouette visible through the frosted glass. He opened it. Elizabeth Morrison stood on the porch, snow covering her coat and hair, her face red from the cold. Behind her, a black SUV sat in the driveway, its engine still running. "I need to talk to you about what happened at the company." James stared at her. Elizabeth Morrison, the CEO of Morrison Construction, Sarah's half-sister. A woman he'd met exactly 3 times in his life, the last of which had been at Sarah's funeral 4 years ago. "This isn't the time." Elizabeth looked past him into the house where Michael was standing now, wrapped in a blanket, his breath visible in the cold air. "You don't have heat. We're managing." "You're not managing. Your son is freezing." James felt his jaw tighten. "We'll be fine." Elizabeth looked at him, and something in her expression shifted. Not pity, exactly. Something harder. "I have a generator in my car. Let me help." "I don't need charity from Morrison." "This isn't from Morrison. This is from Sarah's sister." The wind howled between them, filling the silence. James thought about the 8%, about Michael shivering in the living room, about the temperature dropping every minute he stood here arguing. "Please," Elizabeth said, "let me help." James stepped aside. Elizabeth pulled the generator from the back of her SUV with the efficiency of someone who'd done this before. James helped without speaking, the two of them hauling the machine through snow that came up past their ankles. The wind cut through his jacket like it wasn't there. His hands were numb by the time they got the generator positioned outside the back door, sheltered under the small overhang that kept the worst of the weather off it. She had fuel cans, extension cords, a toolkit that looked professional. James watched her work, crouching in the snow, connecting cables with quick, precise movements. She knew what she was doing. That surprised him more than it should have. "You've set these up before." Elizabeth didn't look up. "My father made me learn. He said anyone running a construction company should know how their equipment works." The generator coughed once, then roared to life. Elizabeth stood and brushed snow off her knees, her breath coming out in white clouds. "That should get you through the night. You'll need to refuel it every 6 hours." James nodded. They went back inside, stomping snow off their boots in the small mudroom. The generator's hum was audible even through the walls, a steady mechanical pulse that felt like safety. Michael was in the kitchen, standing on a chair to look out the window at the storm. He turned when they came in, his eyes going to Elizabeth with the careful assessment kids use when meeting strangers. "Who are you?" Elizabeth hesitated, and James saw something cross her face that might have been pain. "I'm Beth. I'm a friend of your dad's." "Do you know my mom?" The question landed like a stone dropped into still water. Elizabeth's composure cracked just slightly, her mouth opening and closing before she found words. "I did. Yes." Michael climbed down from the chair and walked over, Cooper tucked under his arm. He studied Elizabeth with the same intensity he used when drawing bridges, like he was measuring something invisible. "You have the same eyes." Elizabeth blinked. "What?" "Purple, like in the pictures. Mom had purple eyes." James hadn't noticed until Michael said it, but the kid was right. Sarah's eyes had been an unusual shade of gray-blue that looked purple in certain light. Elizabeth's were the same. Elizabeth crouched down to Michael's level, her voice softer than James had heard it. "Your mom was my sister. Half-sister, actually. We had the same mother. Are you sad she died?" The bluntness of it made James wince, but Elizabeth didn't flinch. "Every day." Michael nodded, like this was the right answer. "Me too." The generator kept running. The house stayed dark except for the flashlight James had set on the counter. Elizabeth straightened and looked at James, her professional mask sliding back into place. "The propane. How much do you have left?" "Enough." "That's not an answer." James met her eyes. 8% when I checked an hour ago. Probably less now." Elizabeth's jaw tightened. "That won't last the night." "I know." "The master bedroom. Which direction does it face?" "South." "Insulation?" "Better than the rest of the house. The landlord mentioned it when I signed the lease." Elizabeth nodded, thinking through something. "One room. Close off the vents to everywhere else. Push all the heat there. The three of us can fit." "The three of us." James heard the presumption in it and felt his pride bristle. "You don't need to stay." "The roads are closed. I'm not driving back to town in this." She pulled off her coat and hung it on the back of a chair. "Besides, you'll need help when the propane runs out." James wanted to argue, wanted to say he'd been handling things on his own for 3 years and didn't need help from someone who'd barely spoken to Sarah in the last years of her life. But Michael was shivering despite the generator, and the temperature outside was still dropping, and pride was a luxury he couldn't afford tonight. "Fine." Elizabeth went to work like she'd been given orders. She closed vents in the bathroom, the kitchen, Michael's bedroom. She brought blankets from the linen closet and piled them on the bed in the master bedroom. She found the candles James had set out earlier and positioned them strategically, away from curtains and paper. Michael followed her around like a curious shadow, Cooper in one hand and questions ready. "Why are you closing the vents?" "So the heat stays in one place instead of spreading out." "Why does heat spread?" "Because warm air moves to cold air." "Why?" "Physics." James watched them from the doorway, something uncomfortable settling in his chest. Michael hadn't been this animated around an adult since Sarah died. He was careful with people, slow to warm up, quick to retreat if someone pushed too hard. But Elizabeth answered his questions without condescension, without the fake enthusiasm adults sometimes used with kids they didn't understand. By 9:30, the three of them were in the master bedroom with the door closed. 4 blankets layered on the bed. Michael in the middle, James on one side, Elizabeth on the other. The propane gauge outside read 3%. James had checked it 10 minutes ago, his fingers so cold by the time he came back in that it took 5 minutes for feeling to return. Michael wanted a story. He always wanted a story before bed, a routine Sarah had started when he was 2, and James had continued because some traditions mattered more than convenience. "Can Miss Beth tell one?" James looked at Elizabeth, who looked startled. "I'm not good at stories." "Please?" Elizabeth glanced at James, something like uncertainty in her expression. He shrugged. She sighed and shifted on the bed, pulling the blanket up over her legs. "Okay. Once there was a boy who could talk to storms." Michael's eyes lit up. James lay back against the pillow and listened to Elizabeth's voice, low and steady, weaving a story about a kid who learned to calm blizzards and redirect rain and convince tornadoes to change direction. Her voice wasn't loud like Sarah's had been, didn't fill the room with the kind of energy that made stories feel like performances. It was quieter, more careful, but it had rhythm, a cadence that pulled you in if you listened close. Michael was asleep in 40 minutes, his breathing evening out, his grip on Cooper loosening. Elizabeth kept talking anyway, her voice dropping even lower, finishing the story for an audience of one. When she stopped, the silence felt bigger than it should have. James turned his head on the pillow. "You didn't have to finish it. I wanted to see how it ended. You were making it up as you went." "So?" Outside, the blizzard screamed. Inside, the room was warm enough that James could almost forget about the 3% propane and the generator that would run out of fuel in 5 hours, and the fact that morning felt like something that might not come. Elizabeth's voice came through the darkness, quiet and direct. "Why didn't Sarah tell me about Michael's heart?" James didn't answer right away. He thought about the question, about what it was really asking. "She tried. You didn't call back. I was in the middle of a merger, 70-hour weeks. I thought—" Elizabeth stopped. "I thought we had time. Nobody ever has as much time as they think. Is that what you tell yourself?" The sharpness in her voice surprised him. James turned to look at her, but in the dark he could only make out the shape of her, a shadow propped against the headboard. "I don't tell myself anything. I just get through the day." Elizabeth was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, the edge was gone. "Sarah used to say you were the most stubborn person she'd ever met." She wasn't wrong. She also said you were the best man she knew. James felt something twist in his chest. She was wrong about that. "Why would you say that?" "Because good men don't lose their jobs right before Christmas. Good men figure out how to provide for their families without needing generators from people who barely know them." Elizabeth shifted on the bed, her voice hardening. "You lost your job because you refused to fire someone who didn't deserve it. That's not failure, that's integrity." "Integrity doesn't keep the lights on." "No, but it's what your son will remember." James didn't have an answer to that. He closed his eyes and listened to the storm and tried not to think about the fact that Elizabeth Morrison, a woman he'd spoken to maybe a dozen times in his entire life, had just articulated something he'd been trying to convince himself of for 3 weeks. At 4:40 in the morning, the propane ran out. James woke to the sound of the furnace cutting off, that particular silence that comes when machinery dies. The room temperature was still decent, maybe 60 degrees, but he knew it wouldn't stay that way. He slipped out of bed carefully, trying not to wake Michael or Elizabeth, and pulled on his boots and coat in the dark. Outside, the storm had shifted. Still snowing, still cold, but the wind had dropped enough that he could see the outline of the fence and the trees beyond it. The generator was still running, a faithful mechanical heartbeat. The propane tank sat silent, its gauge at 0. James stood there for a long time, his breath fogging in the air, and calculated how long they had. The bedroom would hold heat for maybe 2 hours. After that, it would start getting uncomfortable. By dawn, it would be dangerous. He went back inside. Elizabeth was awake, sitting on the edge of the bed with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. "It's out." "I know." "The bedroom will stay warm for a while. Body heat helps." Elizabeth nodded. "How's Michael?" James looked at his son, still asleep, his face peaceful in a way that made James's throat tighten. "He's fine for now." "And after now?" "We'll figure it out." Elizabeth stood and walked to the window, pulling the curtain back to look at the white wasteland outside. "The storm's breaking." "Yeah. When it's light, we can try to get to my car, drive to my house. I have a wood-burning fireplace." James thought about that, about packing Michael into a car in sub-zero temperatures and driving through snow-choked streets to a house he'd never seen, about accepting help from a woman whose relationship to his family was complicated at best. "We'll see how it looks at dawn." They stood there in the dark, two adults who barely knew each other, united by the simple fact of a sleeping child who needed them both to make good decisions. Elizabeth turned from the window. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." Why didn't you take the VP job? Even if you had to fire Angela, you could have used the position to protect other people, change things from the inside. James had asked himself the same question 100 times in the past 3 weeks. He'd run through every permutation, every scenario where he took the job and used it for good. Every version ended the same way. Because Michael would have known. Known what? That I hurt someone to get ahead, that I traded someone else's suffering for my own comfort. James looked at his son, the rise and fall of his small chest under the blankets. He's 7 years old. He watches everything I do. I can tell him the right thing matters, or I can show him. I can't do both if I'm making exceptions when it costs me. Elizabeth was quiet for a moment. Sarah said the same thing once. About what? Our mother wanted her to fire someone, an assistant who'd made a mistake. Sarah refused. Mother was furious. I thought Sarah was being irrational. Elizabeth pulled the blanket tighter around herself. I was wrong. What changed your mind? Watching you lose your job for the same reason. James didn't know what to say to that. The room was getting colder. He could feel it in the way the air bit at his face, in the way Elizabeth's breath was starting to fog. They got back in bed, one on each side of Michael, sharing heat like it was currency. The kid mumbled something in his sleep and rolled toward James, his hand reaching out to grab a fistful of his father's shirt. James put an arm around him and held on. Elizabeth's voice came through the darkness, so quiet he almost missed it. Thank you for letting me stay. You're the one with the generator. That's not what I meant. James understood. He didn't respond, just closed his eyes and listened to the house settling around them, to the storm finally losing its fury outside, to the sound of 3 people breathing in a dark room that was slowly losing the fight against winter. Dawn came gray and cold. James woke to the sound of Michael coughing, a dry hack that meant the air was too cold. The bedroom had dropped to maybe 50 degrees. Elizabeth was already up, layering on clothes, her breath visible. We need to go. James nodded. He got Michael dressed in layers, long underwear and jeans and a sweater and his winter coat on top of that. Cooper went into Michael's backpack along with a bottle of water and the medication James grabbed from the bathroom. They shut down the generator, packed the essentials into Elizabeth's SUV, and pulled out of the driveway at 7:15. The roads were barely passable, snow piled high on both sides, the plows not out yet. Elizabeth drove with the careful precision of someone who understood physics, taking corners slow, accelerating and braking in ways that didn't upset the car's balance. Michael sat in the back with his backpack on his lap, looking out the window at the white expanse of Iowa transformed into something alien and beautiful and hostile. Where are we going? Elizabeth glanced at him in the rearview mirror. My house. It has heat. Will we come back home? James turned in his seat to look at his son. Yeah, bud, when the power comes back on. Michael nodded and went back to watching the snow. James faced forward and tried not to think about the bills piling up at home, about the job applications sitting in his email with no responses, about the fact that he was once again dependent on someone else's charity to keep his son safe. Elizabeth's house was in the north part of Ames, a neighborhood where the lots were bigger and the houses looked like they'd been designed instead of assembled. 2 stories, brick and wood, a detached garage that probably cost more than James's annual salary. She pulled into the driveway and killed the engine. You live here alone? Yes. The house was warm. Elizabeth had left the heat on, and the fireplace in the living room was set up with wood and kindling like she'd been planning to use it. James stood in the entryway and felt the warmth seep into his bones, painful at first, then relieving. Michael explored with the unself-conscious curiosity of a child, opening doors and looking into rooms and reporting back on what he found. There's a library. That's a study. It has 1,000 books. More like 300. Can I look at them? If you're careful. Elizabeth showed James to a guest room on the 2nd floor, a space with a queen bed and a window that looked out over the backyard. You can stay as long as you need. We'll be out by tonight. Power should be back. And if it's not? James didn't have an answer to that. Elizabeth left him alone, and he sat on the edge of the bed and pulled out his phone. Still no signal. He tried the Wi-Fi, found Elizabeth's network, entered the password she'd written on a note card, and left on the nightstand. 11 new emails. 9 were automated rejections from job applications. 1 was from the power company, an automated message saying crews were working to restore service, but no timeline was available. The last was from Stephen. Called the house. No answer. You okay? Let me know. James typed back. At Elizabeth Morrison's. Long story. We're fine. The response came 2 minutes later. Elizabeth Morrison? Sarah's sister? What the hell? James stared at the screen and tried to figure out how to explain the past 12 hours in a text message. He gave up and just wrote, "She helped. I'll explain later." He went downstairs. Elizabeth was in the kitchen making breakfast, eggs and toast and coffee that smelled like something that cost more per pound than James usually spent. Michael sat at the counter on a high stool, swinging his legs, telling Elizabeth about a drawing he'd made at school of a bridge that turned into a spaceship. Why does the bridge turn into a spaceship? Because bridges go to places. Spaceships go to places. It's the same thing. Elizabeth cracked an egg into a pan, her expression thoughtful. That's actually a reasonable analogy. What's an analogy? When you compare two things to show how they're similar. Michael considered this. Is Dad an analogy? Elizabeth smiled, the first real smile James had seen from her. How do you figure? He builds bridges, but he also helps people get places, like the lady at his work. The smile faded. Elizabeth glanced at James, who was standing in the doorway, and something passed between them that didn't need words. They ate breakfast in a silence that felt less uncomfortable than it should have. Michael talked enough for all three of them, a running commentary on everything from the eggs, too runny, to the toast, too crunchy, to the orange juice, perfect. After breakfast, Elizabeth excused herself to her study. James cleaned up the kitchen, putting dishes in a dishwasher that looked like it cost more than his truck. Michael wandered into the living room and started building something with throw pillows and blankets, Cooper supervising from a nearby chair. James found Elizabeth in her study, sitting behind a desk with 2 monitors and a stack of folders. She looked up when he knocked. Sorry to interrupt. You're not. I'm reviewing termination files. James felt his jaw tighten. For who? Everyone Richard Connor recommended firing in the past 6 months. Elizabeth turned one of the monitors so James could see it, a spreadsheet with names and dates and reasons for termination. Angela Martinez wasn't the first. She was the 5th. James scanned the list. 2 were names he recognized, good workers who'd been let go for reasons that sounded official but felt arbitrary. What are you looking for? A pattern. And? Elizabeth pulled up another document, this one filled with email threads. Richard has been systematically removing anyone who might challenge him. Angela was targeted because she filed a safety complaint about a site he was managing. You were targeted because you found the same violations and reported them internally. James leaned against the doorframe. So it wasn't about budget cuts. The company's profitable. We didn't need to cut anyone. Elizabeth's voice had an edge to it, anger barely controlled. Richard wanted you gone because you made him look bad. Angela was collateral damage. What are you going to do about it? Elizabeth closed the laptop. I'm going to the board, tomorrow. And tell them what? That Richard Connor has been using his position to retaliate against employees who report safety violations, that he's created a hostile work environment, that he needs to be terminated. James pushed off the doorframe. They won't fire him. He's been with the company 15 years. Then I'll make it public. You'll destroy Morrison's reputation. Elizabeth met his eyes, her expression hard. My father built this company on integrity. If that's gone, there's nothing left worth protecting. James wanted to argue, wanted to point out that going to war with Richard would cost her more than it would cost anyone else. But he recognized the look on her face. He'd seen it in the mirror 3 weeks ago when he'd walked into Richard's office and refused to fire Angela. Sarah would have done the same thing. Elizabeth flinched. You think so? I know so. The call from Michael's school came at 1:30. Elizabeth answered her cell phone, listened for 10 seconds, and went pale. She looked at James. Michael collapsed. They're taking him to the hospital. James was moving before she finished the sentence. He grabbed his coat, his keys, his phone. Elizabeth was right behind him, car keys in hand. My car's faster. They drove through streets that were barely cleared, Elizabeth pushing the SUV harder than was safe, James gripping the door handle and trying to keep his breathing steady. The hospital was on the west side of town, a low building that looked like it had been expanded half a dozen times without a coherent plan. Dr. Patricia Scott met them in the emergency room, a woman in her 50s with the kind of calm that came from delivering bad news so often it no longer rattled her. She led them to a room where Michael was lying in a bed, oxygen mask over his face, monitors beeping in steady rhythm. He's stable. It was an arrhythmia, triggered by stress. We've given him medication to regulate his heart rate. James pulled a chair up beside the bed and took Michael's hand. The kid's eyes were open, wide and scared. Hey, bud. Dad. The word came out muffled behind the mask. I'm sorry. You don't have anything to be sorry for. I got scared. At school. I was thinking about the storm and the cold and I couldn't breathe and then everything went dark. James squeezed his hand. You're okay now. That's what matters. Dr. Scott stepped closer. The stress isn't just physical. Michael's been through a lot in the past few weeks. Changes at home, financial pressure, the storm. Kids pick up on more than we think. James felt the words land like punches. He looked at his son, 7 years old and already carrying weight that wasn't his to carry, and felt something break inside him. Elizabeth appeared in the doorway, 2 cups of coffee in her hands. She handed one to James and set the other on the bedside table. Dr. Scott looked at her, then at James, her expression shifting to something James couldn't quite read. I'll give you some privacy. We'll keep Michael overnight for observation. She left. Elizabeth pulled up a second chair and sat down on the other side of the bed. Michael looked at her through the mask, his eyes still frightened. Are you going to leave? Elizabeth's composure cracked. No. Promise? I promise. Michael closed his eyes. Within minutes he was asleep, his breathing evening out to match the rhythm of the monitors. James and Elizabeth sat in silence, the only sound the beeping and the hushed voices of nurses in the hallway. After a long time, Elizabeth spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I should have called her back. James didn't ask who she meant. She tried to reach you? 3 times in the last month of her life. I was in negotiations for a merger, 70-hour weeks. I told myself I'd call when things settled down. Elizabeth wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Things never settled down. She knew you were busy. That's not an excuse. No, but it's a reason. Elizabeth looked at him, her face raw in a way he hadn't seen before. I failed her. James thought about that, about Sarah in the hospital bed 3 days before she died, her hand in his, her voice so quiet he'd had to lean in to hear her. She asked me to find you, said you needed family more than you knew. Elizabeth's breath caught. When? 3 days before she died. And you didn't? I tried. You were in Singapore. By the time you got back, she was gone. Elizabeth covered her face with her hands. James let her cry, quiet and controlled, the sound barely audible over the monitors. When she finally looked up, her eyes were red but her voice was steady. I'm not leaving. Not Michael. Not you. I failed Sarah, but I won't fail what she left behind. James wanted to argue, wanted to say they weren't her responsibility, that she'd done enough already, that charity was a poor foundation for anything lasting. But Michael was asleep between them, his small hand still wrapped around James's, and the promise in Elizabeth's voice sounded like something that had been tested and found strong. Okay, Okay? Yeah. Elizabeth nodded once, sharp and final. They sat there in the hospital room as the afternoon light faded and the monitors kept their steady rhythm, and Michael slept, safe for now, surrounded by two adults who were learning what it meant to show up when it mattered. The power came back on at James's house at 6 that evening. Stephen called to tell him, his voice relieved. Heat's running, fridge is cold, you're good to go. James thanked him and hung up. He looked at Elizabeth, who was reading a magazine in the chair beside Michael's bed, her face illuminated by the fluorescent lights overhead. Power's back. She looked up. That's good. Yeah. Neither of them moved. Michael stirred in his sleep, mumbled something that sounded like Cooper's name, and settled again. Elizabeth closed the magazine. What are you going to do? About what? The job. The bills. All of it. James leaned back in his chair. Keep looking. Something will come through. And if it doesn't, then I'll figure it out. I always do. Elizabeth studied him with the same intensity Michael used when measuring people. I want to reinstate you at Morrison. James shook his head. No. VP of Engineering, full back pay, your choice of projects. I said no. Why? Because I don't want my job back as a favor. I want the truth out. I want Richard to answer for what he did. Not just to me, to everyone. James kept his voice low, aware of Michael sleeping 3 feet away. You go to the board tomorrow. You show them the pattern. You make it public if you have to. But I'm not coming back until the company deserves people like Angela Martinez. Elizabeth nodded slowly. That could take months. Then it takes months. What will you do in the meantime? James looked at his son, at the monitors tracking his heartbeat, at the oxygen mask making sure he could breathe. Whatever it takes to keep him safe. Elizabeth stood and walked to the window, looking out at the parking lot where snow was piled in mountains beside the cleared lanes. My father used to say the hardest part of leadership was knowing when to fight. What did he say the second hardest part was? Knowing when to let other people fight for you? James thought about that. About Stephen offering money. About Elizabeth showing up in a blizzard with a generator. About the ways people tried to help when you'd spent so long learning to do everything alone. Elizabeth turned from the window. Let me fight for you. At the board meeting. At the company. Let me do what Sarah asked me to do. Which was what? Show up for family. The word hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning James wasn't sure he was ready to examine. Family. Not blood, not obligation, but choice. The decision to stay when leaving would be easier. Michael coughed in his sleep. James adjusted the blanket around him, tucking it under his chin the way Sarah used to. When he looked up, Elizabeth was watching him with an expression that might have been grief or might have been something else entirely. Okay, fight for us. But we're not charity. We're not a project. If you're doing this, you're doing it because you choose to, not because you feel guilty about Sarah. Elizabeth's voice was quiet but firm. I choose this. Say it again. She met his eyes without flinching. I choose this. I choose you. I choose Michael. And I choose to be the person Sarah saw in me before I forgot who that was. James held her gaze for a long moment, looking for the lie, the performance, the corporate polish. He found none of it. Just a woman standing in a hospital room at 6:30 on a Tuesday evening, promising to fight for a family that wasn't hers by blood, but might be by something stronger. Then we're with you. Elizabeth's shoulders dropped, tension releasing that James hadn't realized she'd been carrying. She nodded once and sat back down in her chair, picking up the magazine like the conversation had been about something ordinary. They stayed at the hospital until visiting hours ended at 8. Michael woke up long enough to eat dinner, bland hospital food that he picked at without enthusiasm. Dr. Scott came by to check on him, pronounced him stable, and said they'd discharge him in the morning if everything looked good. Elizabeth drove James back to his house. The streets were clearer now, The plows having made their rounds, the snow pushed into banks that would take weeks to melt. She pulled into his driveway and left the engine running. "I'll pick you up at 8. We can get Michael together." James opened the door, cold air rushing in. "You don't have to do that." "I know." He got out and stood there for a moment, one hand on the door. "Thank you. For everything." Elizabeth looked at him, her face shadowed in the dim light from the dashboard. "Sarah was right about you." "About what?" "You're the most stubborn person I've ever met." She shifted the car into reverse. "And the best man I know." James closed the door and stepped back. He watched her pull out of the driveway and disappear down the street, her taillights fading into the distance. Then he went inside to a house that was warm and empty and filled with the particular silence that comes when the people you love aren't in it. He sat at the kitchen table and pulled up his email. Sent a message to Stephen. "Michael's okay. Long story. I'll call tomorrow." Then he opened a new message and started typing. Subject line: Request for public hearing, Ames City Council. Body: I am writing to request a public hearing regarding workplace ethics violations at Morrison Construction. He typed for an hour, laying out the case with the precision of an engineer documenting a structural failure. Names, dates, safety violations, retaliation patterns. By the time he finished, it was after 10. He read through it twice, looking for anything that sounded like anger instead of fact, and found nothing that needed changing. He hit send. Then he went upstairs to his empty house and lay down in a bed that felt too big and tried not to think about the fact that for the first time in 3 years, he wasn't facing tomorrow alone. The Ames City Council met on the last Tuesday of February in a room that smelled like old carpet and fluorescent lights. 50 folding chairs faced a raised platform where 5 council members sat behind a long table. Gerald Hutchins occupied the center seat, flanked by 2 men and 2 women whose names James had memorized from the city website, but whose faces still looked interchangeable under the harsh lighting. James sat in the front row with Elizabeth on his left and Stephen on his right. Michael was at Stephen's house with Linda, building something elaborate with Legos, and not thinking about hospitals or heart monitors or the fact that his father was about to accuse a corporation of destroying lives for profit. The room filled slowly. Reporters from the Tribune and the Des Moines Register. Morrison Construction employees, past and present, their faces careful and unreadable. Richard Connor arrived at 6:55 with his lawyers, 3 men in suits that cost more than James's monthly mortgage. They sat in the back, a wall of expensive fabric and cold confidence. Barbara Morrison entered at 6:58 alone, her silver hair pulled back in a style that belonged to boardrooms and country clubs. She didn't look at Elizabeth, didn't acknowledge James, just took a seat in the 3rd row and folded her hands in her lap like she was attending a church service instead of watching her daughter testify against her own company. Gerald Hutchins gavelled the meeting to order at 7 sharp. "We're here to hear testimony regarding a complaint filed by Mr. James Robinson against Morrison Construction. Mr. Robinson alleges wrongful termination and workplace retaliation. Morrison Construction disputes these claims. Both parties will have the opportunity to present evidence." He looked at James over his reading glasses. "Mr. Robinson, you have the floor." James stood. His hands were steady. That surprised him more than it should have. He'd been preparing for this moment for 2 weeks, writing and rewriting his statement, practicing in front of Stephen until the words felt like something he owned instead of something borrowed from legal templates. On December 17th, I was asked to terminate Angela Martinez, a project coordinator who had worked at Morrison Construction for 3 years with exemplary performance reviews. I was told this was a budget reduction. When I asked why Ms. Martinez specifically, I was told it wasn't about performance, it was about numbers. He pulled a folder from his briefcase and opened it. Inside were printouts of emails, performance reviews, financial statements. He'd spent a week assembling them, cross-referencing dates, building a timeline that turned suspicion into fact. Ms. Martinez had filed a safety complaint 6 weeks earlier about a construction site managed by Richard Connor. She documented missing safety rails, inadequate fall protection, and pressure from supervisors to work faster instead of safer. Her complaint went to HR. 2 weeks later, her name appeared on a termination list. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Gerald Hutchins raised a hand for silence. I refused to fire her. I was told that refusal would disqualify me from promotion to VP of Engineering. I maintained my position. I was terminated that same day. James set down the first document and picked up another. In the 6 months prior to my termination, 4 other employees were let go under similar circumstances. All had filed safety complaints. All were classified as budget reductions. Morrison Construction's revenue during this period increased by 12%. More murmurs. Richard Connor leaned forward to whisper something to one of his lawyers. The lawyer shook his head. James continued, I'm not here asking for my job back. I'm here asking this council to investigate a pattern of retaliation that puts workers at risk and punishes people for doing the right thing. A man's word is his bond. If we let companies break that bond without consequences, we're telling everyone in this room that integrity is negotiable. He sat down. The words hung in the air, solid and unadorned. Stephen put a hand on his shoulder and squeezed once. Gerald Hutchins made a note on his legal pad. Thank you, Mr. Robinson. Mr. Connor, you have the floor. Richard stood with the ease of someone who'd testified before, who knew how to work a room. His suit was charcoal gray, his tie a muted blue. He looked like a photograph from a management textbook. Mr. Robinson is a good engineer, no one disputes that, but he's mischaracterizing a business decision as something sinister. Richard's voice was calm, reasonable, the tone of a man explaining basic math to children. Morrison Construction faced genuine budget pressures. We made difficult choices. Those choices were based on objective criteria reviewed by HR and approved by our board. He gestured to his lawyers, and one of them stood to hand out packets to the council members. These are the financial reports from Q4. You'll see that while revenue increased, costs increased faster. We projected a shortfall if we didn't reduce headcount. The terminations were strategic, designed to minimize disruption while maintaining operational efficiency. Gerald Hutchins flipped through the packet. What about the safety complaints Mr. Robinson mentioned? Richard didn't hesitate. Employees file complaints regularly. That's their right, and we take everyone seriously. But correlation isn't causation. These terminations weren't retaliation. They were business decisions that happened to occur after unrelated complaints. And Mr. Robinson's refusal to execute those terminations showed a fundamental misunderstanding of management responsibility. VP-level positions require difficult decisions. Mr. Robinson demonstrated he wasn't ready for that role. Richard sat down. His lawyers remained standing, ready to field questions. James watched them and felt the shape of the argument forming, the way Richard was framing this as a disagreement about competence instead of ethics. Gerald Hutchins looked at Elizabeth. Ms. Morrison, you asked to testify. The floor is yours. Elizabeth stood. She wore a gray suit that looked professional without being expensive, her hair down instead of pulled back the way she usually wore it at the office. She looked like someone's sister instead of someone's CEO, and James realized that was deliberate. My name is Elizabeth Morrison. I'm the CEO of Morrison Construction and Sarah Robinson's half-sister. The room shifted. People sat up straighter. Barbara Morrison's face went still as carved stone. I'm here to testify that everything Mr. Robinson said is true. Richard's lawyer half rose from his seat, then thought better of it and sat back down. Elizabeth pulled out her own folder, thicker than James's, tabbed with color-coded sections. I spent the last 2 weeks reviewing every termination in the past year. What I found was a pattern Mr. Robinson described accurately but incompletely. It's not just 5 employees, it's 17. She handed the first set of documents to Gerald Hutchins, who passed them down the table. All 17 filed safety complaints within 60 days of their termination. All 17 were classified as budget reductions. All 17 had performance reviews rated meets expectations or higher. Ms. Morrison, these are serious allegations against your own company. They're serious violations, Mr. Hutchins. I'm not here to protect Morrison Construction's reputation. I'm here to protect what my father built, which was a company that valued people's lives over profit margins. Barbara Morrison stood abruptly. Elizabeth, this is inappropriate. Gerald Hutchins raised his gavel. Mrs. Morrison, please sit down. You'll have your opportunity to speak. Barbara remained standing. This is my company, my late husband's legacy, and my daughter is telling the truth. Elizabeth's voice cut through the room like a blade. Which is more than you've been willing to do. The two women stared at each other across the rows of chairs. Barbara's face flushed, but she sat down without another word. Elizabeth turned back to the council. The safety complaints weren't trivial. They documented falls that resulted in injuries, equipment failures that could have been fatal, and pressure from management to cut corners. She pulled out another set of documents. These are hospital records, OSHA reports, workers' compensation claims, all from sites managed by Richard Connor, all suppressed or minimized in company reports. Those reports are confidential. Richard was on his feet now, his composure cracking. How did you— I'm the CEO. I have access to everything. Elizabeth didn't look at him. What I found was systematic fraud, safety violations covered up to avoid fines, injuries attributed to worker error when they were caused by inadequate equipment, and a VP who retaliated against anyone who threatened to expose it. Gerald Hutchins leaned forward. Ms. Morrison, are you saying Morrison Construction knowingly endangered workers? I'm saying Richard Connor did, and the board allowed it by not asking hard questions. The room erupted. Reporters scribbling notes, employees whispering to each other, Richard Connor in heated discussion with his lawyers, Barbara Morrison sitting alone, her face a mask that revealed nothing. Gerald Hutchins gavelled for order. It took 2 minutes for the noise to die down. We'll hear from other witnesses. Angela Martinez, please come forward. Angela walked to the front of the room, her movements deliberate and careful. She wore a simple dress, her hair pulled back, her hands clasped in front of her. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but clear. Mr. Robinson saved my job by losing his. I have 2 children. Christmas was 10 days away. If he hadn't stood up for me, we would have had nothing. She pulled out a piece of paper, worn at the edges like it had been folded and unfolded many times. This is the safety complaint I filed. It documented fall hazards on the Riverside project. 3 weeks after I filed it, I was told I was being let go. Mr. Connor personally delivered the news. He said budget cuts. I said I understood, but I knew. Knew what? That speaking up costs people their jobs, that telling the truth gets you punished. Angela looked at Richard. I was right. Gerald Hutchins made notes. Thank you, Ms. Martinez. Other witnesses? 4 more employees came forward. James recognized 2 of them. They told similar stories. Safety complaints filed. Terminations following. Reasons given that didn't match reality. Their testimony stacked like evidence at a crime scene, each piece reinforcing the others until the pattern became undeniable. When the last witness finished, Gerald Hutchins called a 15-minute recess. James stayed in his seat while people filed out to the hallway for water and bathroom breaks. Elizabeth sat beside him, her folder closed, her hands folded on top of it. You okay? I'm fine. That was a lot to put out there. Elizabeth looked at him. It needed to be said. My mother's going to have to accept that I'm not her. Elizabeth's voice was soft but final. Sarah tried to tell me that for years. I didn't listen. I'm listening now. Stephen came back from the hallway with 3 bottles of water. He handed one to James and one to Elizabeth and kept the third for himself. You 2 are either very brave or very stupid. Can it be both? Usually is. The council reconvened at 7:45. Gerald Hutchins shuffled papers and consulted with the other members in whispers James couldn't hear. Finally, he looked up. This council doesn't have the authority to order terminations or reinstatements. That's between Morrison Construction and its employees. What we can do is refer this matter to the Iowa Division of Labor for investigation and recommend that all construction permits for Morrison projects be suspended pending review of safety compliance. Richard Connor shot to his feet. You can't do that. We have contracts, deadlines. Mr. Connor, if even half of what we heard tonight is accurate, you're lucky we're not referring this to law enforcement. Gerald Hutchins's voice was steel-wrapped in Midwestern politeness. The council will vote on the permit suspension in 1 week. In the meantime, Morrison Construction will submit to a full safety audit by an independent third party. All employees terminated in the past year will be offered reinstatement with back pay pending review of their cases. Barbara Morrison stood. Mr. Hutchins, this is an overreach of... Mrs. Morrison, your company has been operating in this city for 60 years. We've given you every benefit of the doubt. That ends tonight. He looked at Elizabeth. Ms. Morrison, as CEO, do you accept these terms? Elizabeth stood. I do. Then this hearing is adjourned. The gavel came down. The room exploded into conversation. Reporters swarmed toward Elizabeth and James. Richard Connor was already heading for the exit, his lawyers forming a protective wall around him. Barbara Morrison sat in the third row, alone, staring at nothing. Stephen grabbed James's arm. We need to go, now. They pushed through the crowd, Elizabeth right behind them, and made it to the parking lot where Stephen's truck was parked under a streetlight. James got in the passenger seat. Elizabeth climbed into the back. Stephen pulled out of the lot and drove 3 blocks before anyone spoke. Well, that was something. James laughed, the sound surprising him. Yeah. Elizabeth leaned forward from the back seat. They're going to come after us. Richard, the board, they won't let this stand. Let them come. James, I'm serious. Morrison Construction has lawyers on retainer who specialize in making problems disappear. Then we make sure this problem is too public to disappear. James pulled out his phone. The Tribune reporter had already published a breaking news alert. Morrison Construction CEO testifies against own company in retaliation case. Stephen turned onto James's street. You're both insane. Probably. Definitely. Elizabeth's voice carried something that might have been relief or might have been exhaustion. But we're insane together. They pulled into James's driveway. The house lights were on. Through the window, James could see Michael sitting at the kitchen table with Linda, drawing something elaborate on a large piece of paper. You want to come in? Elizabeth shook her head. I need to go home. Make some calls. The board's going to have questions. What are you going to tell them? The truth. She opened the truck door. Same thing I told the council. James got out and walked her to her car. Snow was falling again, light and dry, the kind that didn't stick. Elizabeth pulled her coat tighter and looked at him. Thank you. For what? For not letting me walk away from this. From Sarah's family. James thought about that. About the night in the blizzard when Elizabeth had shown up with a generator and a determination to help that hadn't wavered even when it would have been easier to leave. About the hospital room where she'd promised Michael she wouldn't abandon them. About tonight, standing in front of 50 people and choosing truth over comfort. You didn't walk away. You never did. I almost did, 12 times in the past 2 weeks. But you didn't. Elizabeth nodded. She got in her car and rolled down the window. I'll call you tomorrow, after I talk to the board. Good luck. I don't need luck. I need courage. She looked at him through the falling snow. You reminded me what that looks like. She drove away. James stood in the driveway until her taillights disappeared, then went inside to where Michael was showing Linda a drawing of 3 people standing on a bridge, their hands linked together. The board meeting happened on Friday morning in a conference room on the top floor of Morrison Construction's main building. Elizabeth sat at the head of a table that seated 12, facing 8 men and women who looked at her with expressions ranging from concern to outright hostility. Barbara Morrison sat at the far end, her posture perfect, her face revealing nothing. The board chairman, a man named Walter Chen who'd been friends with Elizabeth's father, cleared his throat. "Elizabeth, we need to discuss Tuesday's hearing. I assumed that's why you called this meeting. You testified against the company, your own company. I testified about retaliation and safety violations. The company didn't do those things. Richard Connor did." One of the other board members, a woman named Patricia Ross, leaned forward. "The distinction doesn't matter to our clients. 3 contracts have been suspended pending the safety audit. Our stock price dropped 4% in 2 days. Then we fix the problems and restore confidence. By throwing Richard under the bus," Walter's voice was sharp, "he's been with this company 15 years. He's delivered projects on time and under budget consistently. By cutting corners that endangered lives." Barbara spoke for the first time, her voice cold and controlled. "Elizabeth, you're letting personal feelings cloud your judgment." "This has nothing to do with personal feelings." "Doesn't it? James Robinson was married to your sister. You've been spending time with him and his son. This looks like favoritism dressed up as ethics." Elizabeth felt heat rise in her face but kept her voice level. "James Robinson was terminated for refusing to participate in retaliation. The evidence supports his account. If you read the documentation I provided—" "We read it," Patricia interrupted, "and we agree there are concerning patterns. But your solution, public testimony, permit suspensions, was reckless. You could have handled this internally." "I tried. You ignored it." Walter set down his pen. "That's not fair." "Isn't it? I brought concerns about Richard to this board 6 weeks ago. I was told to let HR handle it. HR reports to Richard. You created a system where the person responsible for the violations was also responsible for investigating them." The room went silent. Barbara's eyes narrowed. Patricia looked at Walter, who suddenly seemed very interested in his notes. Elizabeth pulled out another folder. "I have emails showing that HR flagged 3 safety complaints as requiring board attention. All 3 were sent to Richard for preliminary review. All 3 disappeared from the system. Richard deleted them. That's a serious accusation. It's a documented fact. I pulled the server logs." Walter rubbed his temples. "What do you want, Elizabeth?" "Richard Connor's resignation. Immediate reinstatement of all 17 terminated employees with back pay. Full safety audit by an external firm, results made public. And a new company policy requiring all safety complaints to go directly to the board, bypassing management. That's a complete restructuring of our oversight. That's the minimum to restore integrity." Barbara stood. "I've heard enough. This is a coup disguised as reform. You want Richard out so you can consolidate power." Elizabeth stood to face her mother across the length of the table. "I want Richard out because he's destroying what Dad built. You're so focused on protecting the company's reputation that you can't see the company itself is rotting. Don't you dare invoke your father." "Why not? He's the one who taught me that a reputation means nothing if it's built on lies." Elizabeth's voice shook, but didn't break. "You want to protect his legacy? Then protect what he actually valued. People, safety, doing the work right instead of doing it cheap." Barbara's face flushed. "You sound like Sarah." "Good." The word hung in the air. Barbara sat down slowly, her composure cracking for just a moment before reforming into something harder. Walter looked around the table. "We need to vote. All in favor of accepting Elizabeth's terms?" 3 hands went up. Walter's, Patricia's, and 2 others James didn't recognize. "Opposed?" 4 hands, including Barbara's. "Abstaining?" 1 hand. Walter exhaled. "The motion fails. 4 to 3 to 1. Elizabeth felt something collapse inside her chest. She'd expected opposition, hadn't expected to lose. However, Walter wasn't finished. "Given the public attention and the council's pending decision on permits, I'm recommending we place Richard Connor on administrative leave pending an independent investigation. All in favor?" This time 6 hands went up. Only Barbara and 1 other board member opposed. "Motion carries. Richard will be notified today." Walter looked at Elizabeth. "You'll oversee operations in his absence. The safety audit will proceed, but the other terms, reinstatements, policy changes, will wait until the investigation concludes. It wasn't what Elizabeth wanted, but it was something. How long will the investigation take? 60 days? Elizabeth nodded and gathered her papers. The board members filed out, leaving her alone with Barbara. Her mother stood but didn't move toward the door. "You're making a mistake. I'm doing what's right. Right doesn't keep companies afloat. Right doesn't protect jobs. Right is a luxury for people who don't understand how business works." Elizabeth walked to the window and looked down at the parking lot where employees were arriving for their shifts, lunch boxes in hand, hard hats under their arms. People who trusted Morrison Construction to pay them fairly and keep them safe. Dad didn't think it was a luxury. "Your father had me to handle the difficult decisions. He got to be the good guy because I was willing to be practical." Elizabeth turned. "Is that what you tell yourself? That Dad's integrity was only possible because you compromised yours?" Barbara's eyes flashed. "You have no idea what I've sacrificed for this company." "You're right. I don't. But I know what you're asking me to sacrifice, and I won't do it." "Then you'll destroy everything we built. Or I'll save it." Barbara picked up her briefcase and walked to the door. She paused with her hand on the handle. "Sarah thought like you. Look where it got her." The cruelty of it took Elizabeth's breath away. Barbara left before she could respond, the door closing with a soft click that felt louder than a slam. Elizabeth stood alone in the conference room for a long time, looking at the empty chairs around the table, thinking about her father and her sister and the different kinds of inheritance people left behind. James got the call from Elizabeth that afternoon while he was at Michael's school for a parent-teacher conference. He stepped into the hallway to take it. "How did it go?" "Richard's on leave. Safety audit approved. Everything else is on hold for 60 days. James processed that. "That's not what you wanted." "No, but it's progress." "What about the 17 employees?" "I'm working on it. The board won't authorize reinstatements until the investigation concludes, but I can hire them as contractors in the meantime. Same pay, benefits through a temp agency. It's not perfect, but it keeps them employed." James leaned against the wall. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did." Elizabeth's voice was tired but determined. "James, I need to ask you something." "Okay." "When the investigation's done, when Richard's gone, will you come back? As VP of Engineering?" James thought about Morrison Construction, about the projects he'd worked on, the bridges and buildings that bore his calculations, about the employees who'd testified at the hearing, risking their own jobs to tell the truth. "On one condition." "Name it." "I want Angela Martinez on my team, and I want final say on safety protocols. No exceptions, no overrides." "Done. And one more thing." "What?" "This can't be about me and you, can't be about Sarah. It has to be about the company, about doing the work right." Elizabeth was quiet for a moment. "Is that what you want? For this to be just professional?" James looked through the window into Michael's classroom, where his son was showing the teacher a drawing of a bridge. "I don't know what I want, but I know Michael needs stability, and I can't give him that if we're making decisions based on guilt or grief or trying to fix something that's already broken. Sarah's not broken. She's gone. There's a difference." "I know." "Do you?" Elizabeth's voice was gentle. "Because I spent 3 years thinking I could fix my relationship with her by working harder, being more successful, proving I was worth her time. She died before I figured out that wasn't what she wanted." "What did she want?" "For me to show up. Just be there. Not perfect, not successful. Present." James felt something shift in his chest, recognition of a truth he'd been avoiding. "I can't promise I'm ready for this. I'm not asking you to promise anything. I'm asking you to stop treating this like a transaction. You're not a charity case. I'm not a savior. We're two people trying to do right by a kid who deserves better than what we've been giving him." Through the window, Michael laughed at something the teacher said. The sound carried through the glass, bright and uncomplicated. "Okay." "Okay?" Yeah, just give me time to figure out what this is. We have 60 days until the investigation wraps up. That enough? James smiled despite himself. Maybe. He hung up and went back into the classroom where the conference was waiting. The teacher, a woman named Mrs. Patterson, who'd taught second grade for 20 years, pulled out Michael's file and showed James test scores and writing samples and a conduct report that was blank except for one note. Michael is kind to everyone. He's doing well academically, reading above grade level, math is strong. My only concern is social. What kind of concern? He's quiet, plays alone a lot. The other kids try to include him, but he keeps to himself. Mrs. Patterson pulled out a drawing. This is from last week, art class. The assignment was to draw your family. James looked at the picture. 3 people holding hands on a bridge. Him, Michael, and Elizabeth. Not Sarah. Elizabeth. Who's this? He pointed to the figure with long dark hair. He said it's Miss Beth. She reads stories different than you. James stared at the drawing. 7 years old and already redrawing the map of his family, including people who weren't there by blood but by choice. Is that a problem? Not at all. I just wanted you to know he's forming attachments. That's healthy. I wanted to make sure you knew. James nodded and folded the drawing carefully. Thank you. He drove home with the picture on the passenger seat, glancing at it every few blocks. When he pulled into the driveway, Stephen's truck was parked on the street. Stephen was sitting on the front steps with 2 cups of coffee, one for himself and one for James. Figured you could use this. James took the coffee and sat beside him. How'd you know I'd be home now? Called the school. They said you just left. Stephen gestured to the drawing. What's that? James handed it to him. Stephen studied it for a long moment. He drew Elizabeth. Yeah. How do you feel about that? James drank his coffee, letting the heat burn away the cold that had nothing to do with weather. I don't know. Part of me thinks it's too fast. Part of me thinks it's exactly what Sarah would have wanted. What does your gut say? My gut says I'm terrified. Stephen laughed. Of Elizabeth? Of getting this wrong. Of letting Michael get attached to someone who might leave. Of... James stopped. Of being happy again. Stephen set down his coffee. You know what Sarah told me at your wedding? What? She said you were the most loyal person she'd ever met. Said once you committed to something, you'd die before breaking that commitment. Stephen looked at him. She also said your loyalty sometimes looked like stubbornness, and I should kick your ass if you ever used it as an excuse to suffer alone. She didn't say that. She absolutely said that, verbatim. James laughed, the sound surprising him. I miss her. I know, but missing her doesn't mean you stop living. They sat in silence, drinking coffee, watching cars pass on the street. After a while, Stephen stood and stretched. I should go. Linda's making dinner. You and Michael want to come over? Not tonight, but thanks. Stephen clapped him on the shoulder and headed to his truck. James went inside, where Michael was at the kitchen table with homework spread out in front of him and Cooper sitting beside him like a study partner. How was school? Good. Mrs. Patterson showed you my drawing? She did. Michael looked up, his expression careful. Are you mad I drew Miss Beth instead of Mom? James sat down across from him. No. Why would I be mad? Because Mom's not here and Miss Beth is. The simplicity of it hit James like a physical blow. 7 years old and already understanding the difference between memory and presence, between who you love and who shows up. Mom will always be part of our family. Nothing changes that. But families can grow. They can include new people. Like Miss Beth? Maybe, if that's okay with you. Michael thought about this with the seriousness he brought to bridge drawings and math problems. I think Mom would like her. Yeah? Yeah, they have the same eyes. And Miss Beth reads stories the way Mom used to. Michael went back to his homework. Plus, she's trying really hard, even when she's bad at stuff. James smiled. Like pancakes? like pancakes. They did homework together until dinner time. James made spaghetti, Michael's favorite, and they ate at the kitchen table with the drawing propped against the salt shaker. 3 people on a bridge going somewhere neither of them could name yet, but both were willing to try. The 60 days passed faster than James expected. The safety audit uncovered violations at 6 Morrison construction sites. Richard Connor resigned rather than face termination. The Iowa Division of Labor fined the company $40,000 and required comprehensive safety retraining for all supervisors. Elizabeth implemented every reform she'd proposed to the board: direct reporting of safety complaints, third-party oversight, quarterly audits. The board approved all of it after the local news ran a series on workplace safety that featured Angela Martinez and 3 other employees describing what had happened to them. Barbara Morrison resigned from the board in March. Elizabeth didn't try to stop her. James started as VP of Engineering in April. His first act was hiring Angela Martinez as his Assistant Director of Project Coordination. His second was implementing a safety protocol that required sign-off from 3 people before any corner could be cut for budget reasons. The Riverside Pedestrian Bridge opened in May, 6 weeks behind schedule but built to standards that exceeded code requirements. Michael attended the ribbon cutting with Elizabeth and Stephen and Linda, standing at the rail and looking down at the ravine below. "It won't fall down." James stood beside him. "How do you know?" "Because you built it right." The bridge held. So did the family they were building, one choice at a time, one day showing up after another, learning what it meant to honor the past while choosing the future. On a Saturday morning in late June, James and Elizabeth sat on his front steps drinking coffee while Michael played in the yard with Cooper. The drawing from February was framed now, hanging in the hallway between Michael's school photos and the picture of Sarah on the mantel. "Barbara called yesterday." James looked at Elizabeth. "What did she want?" "To tell me I was right. About Richard, about the company, about all of it." Elizabeth's voice was soft. "She didn't apologize, but she acknowledged it." "That's something. It's more than I expected." They sat in silence, watching Michael build something elaborate with sticks and rocks, his imagination turning debris into architecture. "He asked me something last night." "What?" "If you were going to stay, not just work at Morrison, stay with us." Elizabeth set down her coffee. "What did you tell him?" "That I didn't know, that it wasn't something I could promise for you." "And if I want to promise it myself?" James looked at her, really looked, at the woman who'd shown up in a blizzard with a generator, who'd testified against her own company, who'd read bedtime stories and made terrible pancakes and chosen, again and again, to be present instead of perfect. "Then I'd say we're already family, have been for a while. We just needed to catch up to what Michael figured out 6 months ago." Elizabeth smiled. "That we belong together? That love isn't about replacing what's gone, it's about honoring it by building something new." Michael ran over, breathless and grass-stained. "Come see what I made." They followed him to the backyard, where he'd constructed an elaborate bridge out of sticks and stones, spanning the gap between 2 flower beds. "Does it work?" "Only one way to find out." Michael placed Cooper on one side of the bridge and carefully walked him across to the other side. The bridge held. "See? I built it like Dad, strong and true, the kind that doesn't fall when storms come." Elizabeth reached for James's hand. He took it. They stood there in the June sun, watching a 7-year-old boy play engineer, and understood finally what Sarah had known all along: that families aren't just built by blood or marriage or law, they're built by showing up, by choosing each other, by learning that sometimes the bridges you build to honor the past are the same ones that carry you into the future. Michael looked up at them, gap-toothed smile bright as summer. "Are you coming?" Together, they crossed the bridge.